I'm unmuted. Welcome again. I'm Gail Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of Exceptional Education and Student Services for Duval County Public Schools. And our department works alongside families and schools to accept referrals for students who we suspect have a disability. We do evaluations, we determine eligibility, and we are responsible for the provision of special education and related services. And so our goal today is just to share some general information about the topics will be about program data, some things that might interest you about our students and the district's response to compliance issues. There's been some legislative changes that I wanted to share with you all this morning that I think might be relevant. Of course, if you have a preschooler and we're talking about transition, it won't be relevant maybe to you at this moment, but it's something you can think about for the future of your student or someone that's supporting. There's also some department initiatives, and I also want to provide opportunities for you to ask questions or provide comments to us. I do really want to make sure, though, that there's not any specific students that we're talking about, because this is an open general session. I want to start with the program data. So our district, every district, is called a local education agency, and or for short, it's an LEA. And so each district in the state is evaluated every year to determine how well we're doing with implementing the requirements of the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. And that's the federal guidelines and requirements that there are federal requirements, and the state must follow the federal requirements, and each district must follow the state and the federal guidelines. And so there's these broad indicators. There's things that have to do with how do we meet the compliance with the timely evaluations from consent to completion of the evaluation. It's how well we're doing closing the gap on performance with our students. It has to do with, do we submit timely data to the state regarding our students? And there's many, many more categories, such as are we over-identifying students of a certain race or ethnicity? And so all those things go together into this huge amount of data. And then the state evaluates us and decides, based on all of those data points, did we meet requirements? Do we need assistance? Do we need intervention? Or do we need substantial intervention? And so on the slide that you see, it has the 2021 LEA determination, how well we did with those things, and we met all of the requirements. And so that's a very difficult thing for the district. Any district, if you look at the data across the state, it is a very hard mark because there's so many different things, and especially in the last couple of years. And I know you all have experienced the same thing with the pandemic. It's just been so difficult in so many ways for our families and our students that we're really proud that we were able to get that determination. And I know that's a lot of information. So at the end of the program data, I will take some questions so that you can ask them specific things. The next thing I want to talk about is our graduation rate, and this is for students with disabilities. So the students with disabilities, you can see that we had a dip last year, and that I think had to do with the situation with the pandemic. What we're back up to the same graduation rate as we were in 18-19, now in 2021. The data is always lagged. Obviously, we don't have this year's data because we won't get that until after the summer of next year. Now, one of the things that I think is important is our district as a whole is 89%. So we still have that gap between our students with disabilities for graduation and the overall population. So we still have work to do. And that we really have gone a long way with looking at there's a system that has like early warning signs for kids who might be at risk, like they've maybe have been retained twice, or they are struggling with discipline issues. And so we're trying to be proactive and support those students to help them really be able to graduate on time with their cohorts. So that's what that data shows. And so we still have that gap, but we are moving in the right direction. The next area is secondary transition. And so for the secondary transition piece, each year, all districts in the state are required to complete a self-assessment. And this is based on randomly selected students by the state that are in that transition age range. And we have to do a self-assessment where we go through standards and we look at an IEP and did we have the correct things on the IEP and did we implement the things correctly on the IEP. And so the results from this year that I wanted to share is that we had 100% compliance with those randomly selected students. And then it's twofold because we have to do that self-assessment, and then the state then comes behind us and then says, okay, well, you think that you had correct compliance, but we need to double check that to make sure your standard is as high as ours. And that's called a validation. And so they took those records and they did the validation, and we had 100% with that also. Okay, I'm going to stop there about our data that we have. That's the most recent data. This time of year is not a high, there's not a high amount of data that comes in. Typically in the fall, when I share kind of the state of the district, we have more data. So is there any questions in the chat? I can't see the chat from my presentation mode.
We do have a couple questions. One of them was, what were some of the interventions / activities implemented that got us from needs intervention to meet requirements in 1 year?
What a great question. So specifically for our district is we were in what they call disproportionality with discipline of students over 10 days of suspension for students with disabilities who are Black or African American. And so we worked really, really hard. We set aside money. We worked with our schools to come up with alternatives to suspensions. We purchased a lot of social emotional curriculum to try to help kids, our students be able to appropriately deal with their feelings. We added mental health support to those students. So we invested a lot of money, and that was the area that was really keeping us from that meets requirements. And so now we are not considered proportionate for discipline. And so we are able to be in that meets requirement.
And the other question was, does the graduation percent include students on access points? And Carolyn did answer, yes, all students with disabilities are counted.
Thank you, Carolyn. Anything else? Okay. So I wanted to talk about the legislative changes that have come in so this first one I want to talk about actually started last year, but I think that it's something that I really want our families to, specifically our students that have learning disabilities or dyslexia. So this is about a unique auditory presentation of the Florida standard assessment, meaning that for the ELA and writing portion of that standardized test, if a student meets the eligibility requirement of having a severe decoding deficit, they can have those sections read to them, which means that they are being evaluated for their ability to do the standard and not just on the impact of their severe decoding problem. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think it's going to make a very big difference for some of our students. So back in October 16th, the chancellor had a memo and it said that there is now a process for districts to request auditory presentations of passages on the FSA for language arts and reading and writing. And it started last year and it's going to continue. So it's called a unique accommodation, which means that there's lots of documentation that is required to make sure that we're giving this accommodation to the right students. So an eligible student would need to have documentation that regardless of any other accommodations that we could possibly do, that they need an auditory presentation to be able to access the test, but not only just at the test, that they've been using it in the classroom. So it's an extension of that accommodation that they're already demonstrating success within the classroom. And that the purpose of it is so that they can demonstrate their knowledge on other areas in the standards of ELA and writing that are not related to the decoding. So there are some very specific eligibility requirements, and we're learning more and more about what the state is looking for is regarding that accommodate those documentations. But basically, they have to have an IEP. They have to have a documented deficit in decoding. So what that means is we have to do a standardized test that shows that it's a decoding deficit. It's not anything other than, it's not comprehension, it's not another area of vocabulary, it's actually that they can't decode the words, lift those words off the pages. And that they've been receiving that evidence-based intervention in the core instruction through a tiered support. And that in the daily instruction, they are receiving that accommodation. So for some of our students with learning disabilities, if you gave them a lot of information,
Oh, there you go, Gail.
somehow I got muted. Some of our students, because they have a hard time listening auditorily, if, for example, they were listening to me, they may have a hard time with comprehension. But if I really just have a decoding problem, I might, with a text-to-speech accommodation or an actual reader, I might be able to comprehend at grade level. So that's what they're really looking for. And so there's specific tests that we can do that say, this is when they do it independently, this is when they do it with a computerized voice, and this is when they do it with a reader. And so for students that would be eligible for this accommodation, it would be that those students were significantly below grade level if they're doing it independently, but are on grade level if they have that accommodation. So that's what they're looking for as far as being eligible. And the most important thing is that they're using it in the classroom. This is not something that's just separate from a test. So they're using it all the time through assistive technology. Some of you are familiar perhaps with Bookshare or Learning Ally, or with our students having laptops that use the text-to-speech option, those kinds of accommodations. So last year, there were a total of, it was the very first year that we were all trying to make sure that we were identifying the right people and turning in the right documentation. There were 521 total applications across the state. There were, of those 521, 446 were denied. So we had some work to do in trying to figure out what they were looking for, which is a 14.4% approval rate. There were 35 districts submitted and 20 of them had approved applications. We had about 21 applications and 6 got approved. So I feel like we at least did significantly better than most districts on getting them approved. We already have more than 50 teams, IEP teams, that are requesting this accommodation for this year. So we'll see how we'll learn some more again from those, and we'll see how that turns out for this spring administration of the FSA. This is just one more piece of data regarding this unique accommodation. As you can see, most of the ones that were submitted last year were for 4th and 5th grade. So, and they kind of dropped off from there. 3rd, 4th, and 5th were really the highest, and some, you know, in 7, but there's still, I anticipate many more districts submitting the request for the approval for this unique accommodation for this year. Okay, the next area I wanted to talk about, and this is new legislation for this school year. So there's been, for those of you who work with students that were on access points, or have an individual, have a child with a disability that are on access points, you might have heard some information about some changes with who is eligible for alternate assessment and access points. So I did want to spend a little bit of time going over that piece with you this morning. So kind of want to start from the big picture. So why are we even talking about making the changes on who's eligible for alternate assessment? So the Florida Department of Education every year must submit a waiver if statewide we are over 1% of our students who are on alternate assessment. So they have to submit a waiver, and it has to get approved. And if it doesn't get approved, then the state loses their Title I funding, which is millions, probably billions of dollars to the state. So it's a very high stakes waiver process. And so in order to try to get closer to the 1% or under 1% of the students who were on access points, the state wanted to come back through a state board rule to really think about who is eligible for the alternate assessment. So they came up with a new monitoring plan for this school year, and it was that state board rule that's on the slide. And the most controversial and impactful pieces of the legislation was they removed the courses, the access point courses, from the state directory, which means none of our students who IEP teams had identified as needing access points because they have the most significant cognitive disability were not able to be on access points. And so that caused a lot of heartburn for a lot of us. After significant feedback from the district and from parents and from advocates and from all different places, the state did reverse their decision, and they put back the courses for access point for kindergarten. So we're very thankful that that's still an option. I mean, we understand that we have to be very careful on who we identify as being on access points and alternate assessment, but for some of our students, you know, that we need that option, and we need it starting in kindergarten when those standards happen. So, the kindergarten access point standards are back, and those courses, those teams that had moved those students from access points to general education standards will be reaching out to families to reschedule that meeting to talk about if the student is, maybe the data shows after half a year of working on those gen ed standards that we want to leave them on gen ed standards, or they want to go through the process and consider eligibility again. So what I do want to spend a little bit of time on just some of the changes to the eligibility so that you're a little bit aware of that. So the new definition of most significant cognitive disability is a full scale IQ of 67 or under, or for our kiddos that are not able to demonstrate and attain a reliable IQ score because of the impacts of their disability. And each district has to come up with their own criteria on what we would do if we couldn't obtain an IQ score and submit it to the state for review. So before, they didn't have a specific cut score of an IQ, for a better way of saying that. So to be eligible for access points, obviously we need parent consent because it's a very big decision and we've always needed that. We do have to be considered, students must receive ESE services and be enrolled in access point courses for two FTE periods. And what FTE periods are there's one in October and one in February. So that basically they'd have to be almost a full year demonstrating those general education standards before they were moved on to access points. And for some of our students, that causes us a little heartburn because of the some of our students with the very, very most significant cognitive disabilities really struggle on that general education curriculum. They are required to have the modification and exhaust all, to be eligible, they need to require the modification of the general education curriculum, which means they tried every accommodation and have exhausted those options, and that there needs to be evidence that they're using assistive technology. For example, that we're really using assistive technology to be able to enhance their speech, their communication options, or their access to the material. So these next elements are for only when they're initially looking at a student. So these aren't the students that are already on access points. These are students who we're looking at for the very first time to consider if they need that alternate assessment. So again, we must try the general education classroom curriculum first and demonstrate lack of progress even with direct instruction. They need to be present for at least 70% of the school year prior to the assessment that we're trying to move the student onto alternate assessment. They must be with a certified teacher at least 80% of the school year. And that when whatever measure we use, whatever assessment or evaluation we use to measure that cognitive ability, that IQ score, took into consideration any impact from the student, such as their mode of communication, any vision impairment, hearing impairment, language, in how another language may impact them. So we're really making sure that we're getting an accurate IQ. All right. The next legislative update that I wanted to cover, and I know this section is kind of meaty, so hang in there. I hope you wrote down your questions if you have them. I wanted to talk just briefly. I don't know a whole lot of information because the state has not given us much, but some of you might be familiar with the McKay Scholarship, and that is being folded into and transitioned to the Family Empowerment Scholarship Unique Ability. So the Gardner and the McKay are going under that Family Empowerment Scholarship. So that's a very big change for our families that are using those scholarships. So what is the Family Empowerment Scholarship Unique Abilities? It's a state scholarship funded program, and it allows parents of students with disabilities to choose the academic setting that best meets their child needs. So it gives you that choice, some of those choice options. So it's going to include both the Gardner and McKay. We have tried multiple times, especially before a couple of weeks ago, we had our big choice expo, and McKay is always a big booth where lots of families come for information. And we felt really disappointed that we didn't have firmer information for our families from the state, because the only thing, we don't want to give any information to you all or to any family if it's not vetted by the state, because we don't want to give any misinformation. So there is the website for the McKay information is there. You can also email any questions to mckay@duvalschools.org, and that is manned by a staff member, and they will try very hard to answer your question. Or if the answer is not available now, they'll get back to you when it is available so that you have that information. So for the 22-23 school year, to be eligible, you need to be a resident of the state and have a disability, which is an IEP plan, or have received a diagnosis of a disability from a licensed physician. So we do know that if you're going to apply, that there's 2 scholarship funding organizations. And so it's the students that are on McKay scholarship for this school year will automatically be eligible under the Florida Empowerment Scholarship Unique Ability for the 22-23 school year. However, the parent needs to select the designated funding organization to renew their scholarship. So if your child is eligible, you have an option of attending to attend a participating private school, to use the funding for services and materials on your own. You can attend another public school in Duval, or you could attend a neighboring school district. So all of those options are available through with the new, when the McKay and the Gardner are rolled into the Florida, the Family Empowerment Grant. Okay, that was a lot of information.
Gail,
Is
do you
there-
want to address questions
Sure.
before you move on? Okay. And please, if I do not catch yours, resubmit it in the chat box. The first is copy of the presentation. Yes, will be posted on Facebook this afternoon. How is all this impacting the teachers? Gossip that there is going to be layoffs because of lack of students returning to schools.
Oh my goodness. We have a shortage of teachers right now. We are not laying off any teachers. If you know any teachers, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, we want you. We want you. We will not be laying off teachers, exceptional education teachers for sure. As far as our teachers, you know, if you could say a kind word to a teacher, they have had such a rough go of it. We have had it's just been so challenging these last couple of years, as it has been for you as families. So, you know, I just say, you know, be kind, have to, you know, continue the grace and support that I know you always have for your teachers. As far as these legislative changes, our teachers that teach students who were on access points in kindergarten had a lot of heartburn about this because they were very worried about their students. They were very appropriate. They embraced the gen ed curriculum. They went to training. They really made a strong effort. And because of that effort, I anticipate some of those students staying on general education standards because of the efforts that the teachers have made. As far as the our McKay numbers have really stayed pretty constant, you know, so we're not in general, the enrollment is a little down, but not in with students with disabilities. So I don't anticipate any layoffs or anything like that.
Next question, what's the deadline for applying for the FSA accommodation?
That deadline, because it has to be reviewed at the district level by me and the director of testing and assessments, that deadline has passed for this year. It has to be to the state. There's 2 levels. I don't know if I mentioned that. So even if I approve it and Virginia Hayes approves it, there's a whole nother review at the state level, and that's where the denials came, because they were looking for just, I think a lot of it is the length of time that the accommodation was used in the classroom for that student, and really being able to say that there's, this is when they're tested on classroom assignments and classroom tests. They're on grade level standards. When they do it without the accommodations, they're multiple years below.
Next is, will we also have accommodations for students that are in center schools?
All students are eligible. The IEP team determines appropriate accommodations. There are students that are in center schools are all on access point standards. So they don't take the Florida standard assessment, they take the alternate assessment.
If a student is in a center school, they take the FSAA. Can you clarify that that is still correct?
Yes, I think the name will change with the new BEST standards, that are rolling out, that are now in K2, kindergarten through second grade. And so when the new, whatever the Florida standard assessment becomes, there'll be an aligned alternative assessment like the FSAA.
Are students with gifted IEPs entitled to the McKay?
No. That was kind of harsh. I didn't mean it. Harsh.
No. The answer is no, and it won't be McKay any longer. So when you have a student that you don't know the extent of the effects of the disability for placement, but you receive new information, how do you get them placed properly without going a whole school year?
That's a really good question. These all are. And I just want to go back one step to some of our students have gifted is under the exceptional education in the state of Florida. So some of our students that are gifted are also they have a dual diagnosis, so they could be like learning disabled and gifted. So in that sense, they would, if they had another exceptionality other than gifted, they would be eligible. Gifted in speech, gifted in language, so just want to make sure I clarified that. Okay, and now, so if new information, so especially students coming in from other districts, we always have challenges because everybody does it a little bit differently as far as the setting that a student belongs in. So there's a difference between eligibility and placement. Eligibility is what you have to be eligible under the state rules for the different categories, the 18 different categories of autism spectrum disorder, language impairment, those kinds of things. But then placement is based on the IEP team saying, these are the students' needs. And this is where so you already have done the eligibility, you've written the IEP. So where does that student get those services? And so that sometimes is what can change throughout the year. Certainly eligibility can also change, but that's through a formal evaluation process, usually with an assessment. So if any family is concerned that their child is not, either needs additional assessments because they feel like we missed something, or if they have a concern about the placement of their student, they should go first to their school counselor and share their concerns. If they're requesting an evaluation, it's our obligation to get them on the next meeting to address that, to consider their request.
Is there a specialist in the district with knowledge of dyscalculia?
Oh, that's a hard one to say. We do have we're all trained in the areas of all disabilities. As far as being an expert or someone that's really knowledgeable, I do have a supervisor that I could connect a family with that could help with that.
All right. Do you know if children who are on McKay in the 21-22 school year will be able to remain on the McKay that they're grandfathered in, or will all students who have McKay be transitioned into the new scholarship?
everyone will be transferred into the new scholarship, but they don't have to. The way I'm understanding it is, I say this with the most caution I can, because until it's in writing from the state, I have some trepidation about sharing, but I think they're going to be roll into the empowerment scholarship. They just have to do that piece of which scholarship within that they're going to apply for.
If a student uses this scholarship, does the district lose funding?
The funding follows the student, so that we wouldn't, it doesn't take away money from us, but if we were servicing that student and the student was enrolled with us, we would get that funding.
How do you ensure there are the requisite number of teachers with the gifted endorsement present at each neighborhood school?
So the gifted, even though it comes under exceptional education, it doesn't fall directly under me, but I can share a little bit about that and our goal is to have every school offer gifted services. But because there's an endorsement that's required from the for the teachers to have, we still have some hubs, which means that students, there's feeder patterns to a neighborhood school. So I know it's a priority of the team that works with the gifted program to expand it to as many schools as possible, to really have those kids served in their neighborhood schools, and they're allocated based on the number of students that are in that school that are eligible for gifted services.
And you did address this when you touched on the early grade bands. If schools are telling parents that access points are not until 3rd grade, what should they do?
Yeah. It was messy at the beginning of the school year, so I can understand, and we've been really trying to message from the district because the state really did backtrack on a lot of that, and they originally said no kindergarten, and that then the following years they were going to not have 1st grade and not have 2nd grade. So then the first year would be 3rd grade. And so I can understand where that misinformation, and if we're really trying to push that information out. We didn't get that until the last day before winter break. So I'm anticipating schools understanding it better. I've already sent out some communication to schools. So yeah, there was that confusion at the beginning of the year because the state changed their mind midstream in a very appropriate way, because we want to have options for the most significant kids, cognitive impaired kids, to have that option.
Just a couple more. Will the best standards be more in line than the FSAA for children in center schools?
So there's the access points will be aligned to the best standards, I guess is the best way that I can put it. I think even there's some conversation at the state level about not having a high stakes one time a year assessment, that it may look more like progress monitoring throughout the year. So I anticipate assessments in general in the state looking different, but I think the state is firm that they have decided to have the access points changed to align with the best standards.
And 2 more questions. And if I missed yours, go ahead and pop it in the box right now so I don't miss it. If a student fails a subject, can they work with FLVS?
That's probably a guidance question for your school counselor. I don't want to give any information that's not correct about student progression plan, because that would be the same for any student, if you're a student with a disability or a student that is non-disabled.
And last question, what happens to students with IQ scores? A child is gifted and in a neighborhood school, will the district make arrangements to have the child sent to a gifted magnet school?
The gifted magnet schools are still through school choice, but they would be receiving services. If it was not available in their neighborhood school, then at the elementary level, they would go to a hub. If they want full programming in the secondary, they would go to a school that we would allow them to go to a school that has full-time gifted services.
And one just popped up. Great question. I'm assuming, Terry, that you're referring to matrix scores, but what happens to students with IQ scores just above the cutoff who do not make progress with services and supports? Is there an appeal or exemption from the cut score process?
So I am not at this point seeing any wiggle room with the 67 unless there was some kind of unattainable score involved with that. And so we would just have to continue to do adaptations and accommodations for that student on general education standards. I am so impressed with this group. What great questions.
Great questions. Keep them coming. One more. How do you get your child into an autism school that than general, since it seems like school? Angel, we will address you in a separate chat box. Gail, you ready to move on?
I am. Thank you. Okay, the next section is on just some things that are happening in the district this school year. I thought that might interest the group. So this is the year that we are going to be working with schools to complete their, we call it a BPI. It's the best practices in inclusive education, and it's required to do, the schools are required to do that this year. It's a self-assessment process, and it has to be done before the end of the year. And many schools have already started this process, but it's really when we look at how are we doing with inclusive practices? And what can we do to improve our practices at both the school level? And then we also do a district BPI, which this isn't the year that we do that. Last year was the year that we completed the district-wide BPI. But the team members, some suggestions from the schools can bring in these team members to kind of really talk specifically about their inclusive practices. And it can be things from, we use person first language. You know, we don't say that we say the student, it's a student with autism, not an autistic student. So it can be subtle things like that that really have a culture of and a really big impact in the community of the school, to things that are really serious, like how do we schedule students, and how do the students feel about their how they feel about being a part of the school community. So it's a really good process, and our schools will be working on that. My hope is that some of you get invited to participate or may have already participated in that process. So this is painful. So there is a national shortage of speech and language pathologists, and it's not just a state, it's national. And so in any given day, I have between 14 and 17 vacancies. So what that means is there are some students that are not receiving their speech and language therapy, as much as it just keeps me up at night. And I truly say that it's really not a good situation. So we are committed to making up those sessions. And so the district has sent surveys to parents to see how they would like to make up those sessions. So we're paying for our existing speech and language pathologists to work outside their school day to either provide face-to-face or virtual options for our students that have missed those sessions. Or some of our families in the survey of preferences have said, no, that's just, they have other things going on in the afternoon. I don't think virtual is a good option. And they want us to build it into the summer ESY program, extended school year services. So we've been reaching out to those families. So if you are if you have not received a survey and your child is eligible for speech and language therapy, please reach out to your principal And we'll get that survey out to you, and we'll make sure that we make up those sessions, because that is the right thing to do. It is not something that we can control, but certainly I can control making up the services and making sure our students get the therapy that they need. Another thing that I just wanted to make sure that this group was aware of, we this year, and we were one of the few districts, I think there was only just a couple other districts that offered this option. So our Duval Virtual Instructional Academy, we call it DVIA, they offered asynchronous, which means that the kids work on their own and they can do it at night and the weekends, and they work through their coursework. And they did that from K to 12th grade. And that's something we've always offered in the district. This school year, they also offered synchronous for elementary school. So what that meant is it looked a lot like Duval homeroom, kind of, except it was a separate school where you have choice that parents applied to and enrolled their students. And so when I heard that we were doing those options for students that were on general education standards, and that includes all of our students with disabilities, but for our students on access points, those options weren't available. So we created a synchronous access point option for our students K-12. And we were able to do that by grouping those populations together. So even if in a brick and mortar school, you're in an inclusive setting, 100% of the time, in DVIA access points, you were grouped together with students all students that were on access points. So those teachers could really do a deep dive, because most of our students on access points really struggle with virtual instruction because they have more complex learning needs. And so we offered all of our courses and related services virtually through that option. And for those families that were very apprehensive of sending their students to a brick and mortar school this school year because of the pandemic, but perhaps weren't eligible for hospital homebound services, this has been a very popular option, and we're getting very good feedback. Now, if anybody on this call that knows me, I'm very transparent. It was a rocky start because we went from having 200 kids enrolled in DVIA as a whole to 3,000 within a very short period of time. So there were some bumps in the road, but overall, our families have been very happy with that service. And I just wanted to do a plug for our new transition program. We opened a second project search site. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, that's a national transition to work program with the goal of getting our students into competitive employment. The new site is at UF Shands in the hospital setting, and those students are doing internship rotations for career exploration and also hands-on training, with the goal that they will either be hired by Shands, the UF Shands, or another hospital setting that offers a similar work setting. And we also have one at UNF where the students rotate through. They do all kinds of things. They do clerical work there. They work in the food court. They work in the stadium. They do all kinds of things on campus in the same capacity. So I'm just very, very, very proud of the transition programs that we have. We have really tried to expand. We have more kids than ever getting industry certification through dual enrollment at FSCJ. So I really feel like, we could always do more, but our goal is to have as many preferences that match the kid's skill set available for those kids who have deferred their diploma, but still need transition services. The next thing was just to let you know that we're working with our what we call varying exceptionality teachers. Those are the teachers that work in inclusive settings with our students. So they push in services and work with the general education teacher to work with those students that have disabilities. And so we really wanted to give them specific strategies to really close that achievement gap so that our kids with disabilities are working on grade level standards. So it's we had started it last year. So we have 2 different cohorts. We have a year 1 cohort, which is a new group this year. And then that group that already went through 1 year of that master educator program to they're in year 2. So we really just want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to get the best instruction and strategies in front of those students with disabilities to close that achievement gap. Okay, that's it for me, but I would be happy to answer more questions.
All right. How do we get on the committee to be part of the BPIE? And can you clarify what that is?
Okay, so the BPI is best practices for inclusive education. And it's just a one-time group that comes together that provides feedback on certain indicators on how the school itself is doing with inclusive education of students with disabilities. And I think if they were interested, they could certainly reach out to the principal of the school and say, hey, I just learned about the BPI and I would love to participate. Has it already been completed for this year, or is it still coming up and I can participate?
Deadlines for requesting ACT and SAT accommodations, and are these tests required in order to graduate?
Okay, SATs and ACT is not required to graduate. I think there's some kind of a, this is not my area of expertise. You can get, sometimes that score can be used if you don't have the FSA requirement for graduation. I am not the one that should be asking that question. I highly recommend they go to their school counselor. Those are the experts, and I don't want to give any misinformation.
If a student does not pass the FSA in 11th grade, what happens to their graduation timeline?
So some of our students, I'm assuming it's a student with a disability. So some of our students with disability are eligible for waivers if the IEP team feels that they have mastered all of the standards, but are unable because of their disability to be to demonstrate on a high stakes test that one opportunity or retakes, to be able to do that. So there is that waiver opportunity.
Next, is there an option for home tutoring for students in the ESE program?
So I know that there's going to be rolling out lots of after school tutoring for students, all students that experience learning loss. Other than blended learning, I don't know of any district programs that provide in-home tutoring. I know that there's our teachers who work with the students that need in-home services for hospital homebound do provide instruction in the home.
Students with severe behavioral needs with an IQ above 67, how is safety addressed in that environment?
So we have a continuum of services for our students that have emotional and behavior disabilities. Some of those students can be supported in a general education classroom with a positive behavior plan or a functional behavior assessment that can be done and supported that way. We also have self-contained settings. And then in our most restricted setting, we have students that are in our Pride program, which is a pretty separate program within our schools. And those staff members are trained in professional crisis management, which is a prevention, de-escalation, and crisis management system to be able to keep people safe.
My son was denied speech therapy. He has a trachea. Should parents still push to receive therapy?
So I'm assuming that the child was ineligible. They certainly can come back to the team and have a conversation about that, and the team can either consider to evaluate again or to give a notice of refusal that the team does not feel like they can that an assessment is appropriate to determine eligibility.
Duval County Public Schools relationship with Voc Rehab. Is there one, and what are we doing to work with them?
Yeah, we are working with Voc Rehab. We're actually required to do that as far as the transition process. And so we have a strong relationship. I know that, they struggled with this year with keeping their staff members like we have in all areas of work. But I think that it's getting better every year with our contacts with Voc Rehab.
Determining factors for the waiver in regard to the FSA.
There's a whole process for that. I would recommend that, I'm assuming that the student is in high school now, so they should reach out to the ESE teacher that's the case manager for the student, and they can walk them through that process.
Another SAT, ACT accommodations, can they add that as a part of the IEP? Case managers in high schools are not telling parents that they need to be requested separately.
So the accommodations are not, there's no specific accommodations for that's not going to say on the ACT, this accommodation. It's going to be the classroom and assessment accommodations. And then you do have to request it separately, I believe. And again, that's a school counselor specific question, because that's not related just to students with disabilities.
The next, where can I find a list of schools for students with disabilities if I'm not happy with my current school?
Okay, so every school in the district, including our charter schools, have students with disabilities with IEPs in attendance. However, if a student have deeper needs that need deeper services, then it's usually a district assigned school. And so if the student is served in a general education classroom with push-in support and therapy at a school, they go through the regular choice option. They can go to any school in the district. If you go to the choice website or to the ESE placement page on our website, there's a specific list. So if a student is in a communication social skills program, so CSS, there's a list of all those schools that have the CSS program. Now, the caveat is, unless you go to the one that is district designated, then the parent is responsible for transportation. And it's based on space availability. So we can't overcrowd a school by taking a student from the beaches area over to the west side, because we have to have space for the west side students. But if there's room in that school and the parent would like to transport, then we would they could request it through a special special assignment form that's on the website.
What boards and committees, I love this question, what boards and committees would you suggest parents join to support students with disabilities in the county? I love it.
ESEAC, this one.
This one, and we will address that at the end of the meeting. Angel will provide information with how you can do that.
That's great. And I also encourage families to go to their sit on the boards in their schools. So there's a voice for our students that are part of any parent organization that is at your school. Please try, if you have the time and the interest, because then you are a voice for our students with disabilities at that school. So there's twofold: specific for ESE. I love the ESEAC, but really encourage you to get involved with whatever school your child attends so that voice is heard.
I would also encourage Family Care Council too. I know Duval is in area 4, that you can type that in, Family Care Council area 4, and that info will pop up. How can I find out more about the optional or added service setting in DVIA? So
I don't think they're taking any more for this school year, but it should be actually You can just reach out to me if you want to know more about it. Roberts G at duvalschools.org if someone wants to put it in the chat. For some reason, I can't see the chat, but I'm sure someone can put it in for me. I'll be happy to talk about it. And I don't know if that's going to be a continuing option. I know it was a decision because we wanted to make sure that there was equity. And if students without disabilities had access to that, then we wanted to make sure that all of our students, including the students on access points, had an option virtual if the family wanted to pursue that virtual option.
Who's the point of contact at each school for assessment and program ESE questions?
So I would start with your child's teacher. That would be the first person. There also is, if you look on the Duval website in the Exceptional Student Education webpage, there's a contact information list there. And if we have regions, so if you're in the elementary north, if you're northwest of the river, you have a support team there with a supervisor that can answer questions if they're unable to answer your questions at the school. But I always want you to start with the school because they're the ones that know your child best and could best answer the question. But then there's a region on the southeast side, and then there's a secondary region. So there's always that. If there's additional calls, you can always reach out to anybody on that contact list, or just call the parent services number or email, and we'll get you to the right person.
Did you say it was a virtual school for student? I'm sorry, a Zoom user. I'm not sure in what regard you're referring to.
Let me try again with just the overall. So DVIA is our virtual school, and every school in every district in the state has a virtual school. It's always been asynchronous, which means kids take, and it was only gen ed standards. So students took the courses on their own. They could take it anytime. They can check in with their teachers, but there's not any scheduled classroom throughout the day. They're not having to have reading at 8, that kind of thing. And so because of where the pandemic was at the start of the school year, the superintendent made the decision that for elementary students, we wanted to offer that synchronous, which means they go into school and they have a schedule and they're with the teachers all day during the school day. Students on access points didn't have an option. And so we added that layer, and it's K-12 through 12th grade. And those students work with teachers throughout the day on access points curriculum.
M. Brown, I would refer you to Roberts G at duvalschools.org. Right under your question, there's an email listed. That's a specific question that should be addressed in a private email. And it looks like we're done with questions. If I missed any, please type it in now. I do want to talk about the ARC, Gail, and how they support IDD and how they can be a part of the advocacy department and complete their applications if they need help. You have anything to add on to that?
No, not at this time. Anybody else from the board?
Denise, let me.
While you're doing that, I just for clarification, so these are general information sessions, and they're topics that happen, I think 4 times a year. But the board itself really is my sounding board. So and they if I am trying to make a big decision, or if they have feedback that they know something's happening in the community and they want me to address it. So it's really important that we get good representation. And so that's the difference between the ESE advisory committee and these general sessions. And so if you're interested in doing that, do we have a way for them to apply?
We will soon on the ESEAC website.
Perfect.
And it will be, I believe, a Google Doc. Don't take my hard words, but it will be available soon. Can community partners, BCBA, speech and language paths, OTs, et cetera, providers go into schools to provide the services to meet IEP requirements or supplement if private insurance covers those services?
So the state does have a instructional private provider process. So that process, it's not to implement the goals and objectives on the IEP or the services. That's our responsibility. The only thing that goes on an IEP are things that the district is going to provide and obligated to provide. But some of our families do have providers, and they have to go through the process, which is also on our website, where they have to get clearance, through for their provider. And then the amount of time and when they come into the school is up to the principal, because we have to be very cognizant of instructional time and also the impact on the other students. And so sometimes those students are pulled into a separate environment to get their therapy. Sometimes it's pushed in, but it's not like all day long, because that would impact the classroom as a whole.
Families that missed the Choice Expo, where can they receive the information that was provided there, and when is the next one?
Oh, very good question. Choice, that there's only one expo, but if they went on to the school choice department website on the DCPS website, there'll be information specifically about that.
All right, and Rachel, yes, this meeting is being recorded, so you can refer to it later. And I think that's a wrap with questions. I'll give a few more seconds if anybody wants to drop one in. Looks like we're wrapping up.
I sincerely appreciate the thoughtful questions and your participation with us this morning. I couldn't be more pleased about the thoughtfulness of the conversation. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yes, very much. You guys were very engaged, which is awesome. We love the questions. The recording will be posted on Facebook, FND Poppins page. If you look a couple comments up, you can copy and paste that into your Facebook search engine, and it will populate that. Okay, questions. If my child is currently in DVIA, would I have to reapply?
That's a DVIA question.
All right. How equipped are elementary magnet schools? How equipped are elementary magnet school teachers to work with kids with FBAs in comparison to their general zoned elementary school? Are magnets working with less staff and support services?
The allocation is not any different for when I do the allocation for teacher positions and SLPs and all the rest. It's based on the students that are there, not different from the magnet program. We do have district BCBAs that work with all schools with FBAs if needed. So there should not be, if they could be served in their neighborhood school, they should be able to be served in a magnet school.
All right. Well, Gail, thank you so much for that slew of information. It was a lot of good updates. I just saw another question pop up. Is support different for, what does support look like in charter schools? Is it different?
So charter schools are expected to offer the same services as all of our schools. they are not expected to have the district designated specialized programs like our CSS or SLA or those kinds of programs. But the expectation is they provide the same level of service that the threshold of services that all of our schools have.
Students enrolled in virtual, can they attend specific after-school programs for IEP assistance? iPhone, I assume that you are referring to meeting certain goals and objectives.
So if a student needs services beyond the school day to meet their IEP goals and objectives, then is an IEP decision, and it would be extended school year services. So any student in the district the team could come together and make that determination.
All right. They said thank you.
I am going to stop recording now.